The Elven Council chamber was cold and silent when Lyran Silverveil walked inside with chains on her wrists and anger in her heart. But she kept her face empty of emotion because showing feelings would only make things worse for her now, and she had learned long ago that pride was a luxury warriors could not afford when standing before those who held their fate in ancient hands high. Magister Valithus sat on his crystal throne and looked down at her with eyes that had seen 1,000 years pass like water through fingers, and he spoke in a voice that carried no warmth or mercy when he told her that she was found guilty of the crime of disobedience and the crime of questioning orders and the crime of putting her own judgment above the wisdom of those who had ruled their people since before her grandmother was born. Lyran wanted to scream at him and tell him that his orders would have killed innocent people in the border villages, and that sometimes the old wisdom was just old fear dressed up in fancy words, but she said nothing because words would not change what was coming, and she had always known that her choices would lead to this moment sooner or later. Beside stood Emberclaw, and even though the dragon was forced to stay in his smaller form to fit inside the chamber, everyone could feel the heat radiating from his copper scales and see the smoke curling from his nostrils as he fought to control his rage because dragons did not like to see their bonded partners treated with disrespect, and Emberclaw had been with Lyran for 3 centuries of battles and blood and brotherhood that went deeper than family. The High Magister announced the punishment, and Lyran felt her stomach turn cold because exile was bad, but this was worse than simple exile because they were sending her to the human world, and everyone knew that the human world was classified as Class 15, which meant it was a death world, where everything existed to kill everything else, and even the air and water could be dangerous if you were not careful. Valithos explained that the humans themselves were the worst part of that world because they were savage creatures who fought each other constantly and who had no magic or culture or anything that made a civilization worth the name, and they would probably kill her within days if the world itself did not do it first, and the council believed this was a fitting end for someone who had forgotten her place. The portal opened behind her, and it looked like a wound cut into reality itself, and through it she could see green trees and blue sky, and everything looked deceptively peaceful. But Lyran knew that death worlds were good at hiding their dangers until it dimmed up. It was too late to run, and she also knew that arguing or begging would accomplish nothing because the decision was made and the council had already moved on to other matters in their minds. She walked through the portal with her head high, and Emberclaw followed without hesitation because where she went, he would always follow, and that's the nature of the bond between elf and dragon, and nothing could break it except death itself, and maybe not even then if the old stories were true about souls that stayed connected across the Veltha world on the other side. Hit her senses like a physical blow, and everything was too much and too loud and too chaotic compared to the ordered perfection of the elven realms where magic kept things neat and controlled and predictable. But here the magic was wild and raw and woven into every living thing in ways that made her head spin. Emberclaw expanded to his full size the moment they were clear of the portal, and his wings spread wide enough to cast shadows over several trees, and he roared his anger at the sky because dragons needed to announce themselves and claim territory and warn anything nearby that a new predator had arrived in their midslaron. Them and knew there would be no going back because exile was permanent, and the council would never forgive or forget, and she was truly alone. Now, except for Emberclaw, who was circling above the forest and scanning for threats with eyes that could spot a rabbit from a mile away. The forest around them was dense and green and full of sounds that she did not recognize and smells that were both familiar and strange at the same time. Because plants were plants everywhere, but these ones had evolved in different ways and adapted to different pressures, and she could feel the aggressive life force radiating from every leaf and root. Within an hour of arriving, she watched a small, furry creature get snatched by a larger furry creature that dropped from a tree branch like a brown shadow, and the kill was efficient and brutal and over in seconds, and she realized that this was normal here, and that everything in this forest was either predator or prey, and sometimes both, depending on what else was nearby. Emberclaw landed beside her and spoke directly into her mind the way bonded dragons always did, and he told her that he could sense massive creatures moving through the southern SWAT regions and flying creatures that ruled the skies in flocks. and water creatures that lurked in the rivers and lakes, and everything was hungry and everything was dangerous. She told him they needed to find the humans, because if they were going to survive here, they would need allies who understood this world and its rules. And even though she had been taught that humans were primitive and weak, she had also been taught that the Elven Council was always wise, and recent events had proven that teaching wrong. They moved through the forest carefully, and Liren used her magic to hide their presence from mundane senses, but she kept the spells light because she did not know what else might be watching. With other types of sight, and drawing too much attention could be fatal in a place like this. Evening, they reached the edge of the forest and saw human structures in the distance, and the buildings were made of wood and stone and metal in combinations that looked strange to her eyes, but also sturdy and practical in ways that elven architecture, with its focus on beauty, sometimes was not. She could see humans moving between the buildings, and they wore simple clothes and carried objects she did not recognize, and they seemed completely at ease in their deadly world, as if they had forgotten or never known that they lived surrounded by things that could kill them. Emberclaw wanted to fly down and announce their presence in the traditional dragon way by landing in the center of the settlement, roaring a challenge, but Liren stopped him because humans probably would not understand dragon customs and might react with violence born of fear instead. She cast a glamour over Emberclaw that made him appear as a very large dog to human eyes, and she adjusted her own appearance too, hide her pointed ears and make herself look more human, and together they walked down from the forest toward the town as the sun began to set. Settlement was called Millbrook according to a sign at the edge, and it was small by elven standards, but it had a feeling of permanence and community that surprised her, because she had expected humans to live in temporary camps and move around constantly. Following food, she entered a building that had warm light glowing through its windows and a sign that said it was a place where humans ate food together. And inside, she found a long counter with stools and tables with chairs, and the smell of cooking meat and bread that made her stomach remind her she had not eaten since morning. A human woman stood behind the counter, and she had gray hair and sharp eyes, and moved with the easy confidence of someone who had seen much and survived it all. And when she looked at Liren, there was a moment of assessment that reminded Liren of how veteran warriors sized up potential threats. The woman introduced herself as Kate Morrison and asked if Liren was new to town, and Liren said yes, because it was the truth. And Kate poured a cup of something hot and dark and pushed it across the counter without being asked, and told her to sit and rest because she looked like she had traveled far. Lynn sat and tried the drink, and it was bitter but also energizing, and she realized it had some kind of stimulant in it that humans use casually, and she wondered what else these people consumed without thinking that would be considered dangerous in other places. Kate asked direct questions about where Liren came from and what brought her here, and Liren realized she could not maintain her cover story when she did not know enough about human customs and geography. So she made a decision that could either save her or doom her. She told Kate the truth, but she did it quietly so other humans in the building would not hear. And she explained about the elven realms and the exile, and the shadow legions that were coming through dimensional rifts to invade this world and consume everything living. Here Kate listened without interrupting, and her face showed nothing, but her body language shifted in small ways that Liren had learned to read in warriors. And when the story was finished, Kate was silent for a long moment before she asked if Liren could prove any of it. Liren dropped the glamour on Emberclaw, and suddenly the large dog became a massive dragon curled in the corner of the diner, and his copper scales reflected the lights, and his eyes glowed with inner fire. And Kate drew in a sharp breath, but did not scream or run, and that told Liren more about human courage than any story could have. Kate made a decision quickly and told Liren to follow her, and she led them down to a basement beneath the diner, where she made several calls on a device that let humans talk across distances. And within an hour, other humans began arriving. They came one by one, and Kate introduced them as people she trusted. And there was Linda Hayes, who ran the town, and Amy Brooks, who kept the peace, and Claire Winters, who... The next morning, Liren woke in a small room above the diner, and for a moment she forgot where she was until she heard the sounds of the human town waking up outside her window, and remembered that she was in exile on a death world and about to fight a war with allies who should not be able to win. Kate brought her food and explained that word was spreading through the community about the threat and that humans were already beginning to prepare even though most of them had never seen magic or aliens or dimensional rifts before yesterday. Larian went outside with Emberclaw and saw humans moving with purpose through the streets, and they were carrying supplies and organizing groups and making lists, and she realized that these people knew how to mobilize quickly when danger threatened Claire. Winters had set up equipment in her laboratory, and when Liren entered, she found the scientists studying readings from devices that measured energy patterns, and Claire explained that she had been tracking anomalies for weeks without knowing what caused them. The anomalies matched the rift signatures that Liren described, and Claire showed her graphs and charts that mapped where the rifts were forming and how quickly they were growing, and the data suggested that the main attack would come from the mountains east of town. Liren spent hours teaching Claire everything she knew about Shadow Legion energy patterns and how they manifested and how they corrupted living matter into husks that served their purpose, and Claire took notes and asked questions that made Liren see the problem in new ways. Claire theorized that if the shadow energy worked on specific frequencies, then human technology might be able to disrupt those frequencies and create weapons that could hurt beings that were normally immune to physical attacks. They worked together, combining elven magical theory with human scientific method, and the result was strange hybrid devices that should not work according to either system alone, but somehow functioned when both approaches were merged. Meanwhile, Kate was making calls to former Mespric contacts and explaining the situation in ways that sounded insane, but her reputation and tone convinced people to at least come and see for themselves before deciding she had lost her mind. Veterans began arriving from across the region, and they came with questions and skepticism until they saw Emberclaw and watched Liren demonstrate magic. And then they stopped asking if it was real and started asking what they needed to do. Amy Brooks organized the town militia and began training sessions where people who had never fought anything more dangerous than arguments learned to handle weapons and work as units and follow orders under stress. Maggie Stone took a different approach and gathered the ranchers and hunters and guides who knew the land and the wildlife, and she explained that they were going to turn the death world itself into a weapon against invaders who did not understand what they were facing. She showed them maps of the territory and marked locations where dangerous animals lived and where natural hazards existed and where the terrain could be used to create ambushes and traps. Lorraine went with Maggie into the wilderness and saw firsthand what made this world Class 15 because they encountered massive bears that could tear apart trees and venomous snakes that hid in every shadow and insects that carried disease and plants that caused painful reactions if touched. Maggie moved through all of it with casual confidence and explained that humans had learned to coexist with these dangers by being smarter and more adaptable and more willing to use tools and cooperation than any other species on the planet. She pointed out mountain lions that watched them from high rocks and explained that these predators could kill adult humans easily, but rarely did because humans had proven over generations that hunting them was more trouble than it was worth. They found a marsh full of creatures Maggie called alligators, and Liren stared in horror at the armored reptiles with jaws strong enough to crush bone, and Maggie laughed and said that humans in some regions raised these creatures on farms and used their skin for clothing. Back in town, Beth Turner was teaching combat tactics to volunteers, and Liren watched as farmers and shopkeepers and teachers learned to move as squads and provide covering fire and execute flanking maneuvers. Beth had fought in multiple human conflicts, and she brought that experience to the training. She was patient but firm, and she made it clear that hesitation would get people killed, and that following orders might feel wrong sometimes, but it kept everyone alive. Linda Hayes coordinated everything from a command center in the town hall, and she managed supplies and schedules and personnel with the efficiency of someone who had run complex operations before. Even though she claimed to be just a small-town mayor, Liren realized that humans had systems and hierarchies and organizational structures that worked effectively, even in crisis situations, and that their lack of magic had forced them to develop social technologies that her people had never needed. Claire made A breakthrough on the third day when she successfully created a device that could detect rift energy at distance and give early warning before Shadow Legion forces manifested, and she immediately began building more units to deploy around the territory. She also developed prototype weapons that fired concentrated bursts of energy, attuned to disrupt shadow manifestations, and the first tests were promising, even though the weapons drained power quickly and had limited range need. Cole Grant joined. The research team had brought expertise in electrical engineering, and together she and Claire designed a network of emitters that could create zones where wraiths would be forced to manifest physically and become vulnerable to conventional attacks. Patricia Webb worked on biological approaches and studied samples of corrupted matter that Liren provided from her memory, and Patricia theorized that Earth bacteria and viruses might be able to attack Shadow Legion physiology because the invaders would have no immunity to diseases from this dimension. The work was intense and exhausting, and everyone pushed themselves beyond normal limits because they all understood that failure meant death, not just for themselves, but for their entire world. Lorraine spent time with different groups and taught them what she knew about fighting shadow legions, and she was surprised by how quickly humans adapted information and applied it in creative ways she had never considered. She showed them how husks moved and attacked, and the humans immediately developed tactics to exploit the patterns, and they created formations that maximized their advantages while minimizing their weaknesses. She explained how wraiths fed on fear and despair, and the humans responded by developing mental disciplines and buddy systems, where people watched each other for signs of corruption and pulled each other back from the edgy Burklaw, flew reconnaissance missions over the mountains, and mapped the growing rifts in each day. He reported that the energy was building and the timeline was holding, and they had perhaps 2 weeks left before the vanguard arrived in the evenings. People gathered in the diner and shared meals and stories, and Liren learned about human culture and history, and she heard tales of their wars and struggles and achievements. She learned that humans had faced extinction multiple times in their history, and had survived through determination and innovation and sheer stubborn refusal to give up, even when logic said they should. Learned that they had fought each other for resources and territory and ideas, but had also learned to cooperate and build alliances and create societies that protected the weak and valued individual lives. She learned that their world had tried to kill them with ice ages and plagues and volcanic eruptions and meteor impacts, and they had survived all. Spread across their entire planet one night, Kate sat with her and asked what the elven realms were like. And Liren described the crystal cities and the ancient forests and the perfect order that magic maintained, and Kate listened, and then said, "It sounded beautiful, but also a little boring." Lorraine laughed because it was true, and she had never admitted it before, but elven society was stagnant and unchanging, and everyone knew their place and followed the old ways, and nothing new ever happened. Kate said that humans valued change and growth and the freedom to make mistakes and learn from them, and that maybe being thrown out of paradise was the best thing that could have happened to Lyrena's. The days passed. Lyrene watched the town transform. And defensive positions were built, and supplies were stockpiled, and weapons were distributed, and everyone had a role and a purpose. Children who should have been playing games were learning first aid and how to spot rift signs and where to run if defenses were breached, and they took it seriously because human children understood that their world was dangerous. Helen Price was an elderly woman who had survived human wars decades earlier, and she taught people how to make improvised explosives from common materials, and her hands were steady, and her mind was sharp despite her age. Sophie King was a 10-year-old girl who asked Emberclaw if she could ride him into battle, and when the dragon gently refused through Liren, the child simply nodded and said she would fight from the ground instead. The transformation amazed Liren, because her people would have spent months in meetings and debates, and eventually decided the threat was too great and retreated behind their magical barriers. But humans had no barriers to retreat behind, and nowhere to run even if they wanted to, and so they simply... The rift tore open across the eastern sky like a wound bleeding darkness into the morning light, and Liren felt the familiar cold dread of Shadow Legion energy washing over the mountains, and for a moment she was back in a dozen other battles, on a dozen other worlds, watching civilizations fall. But Then she looked around and saw the humans standing steady in their positions, with weapons ready and faces set with determination, and she remembered that this world was different, and these defenders were different, and maybe the outcome would be different too. The husks came through first, and there were hundreds of them, and they had once been living beings from other worlds. But now they were just shells filled with shadow energy and driven by a single purpose to consume and corrupt everything they touched. Behind the husks came the wraiths, and they were harder to see because they existed partially in other dimensions, but Lyran could sense them, and she knew they were the real danger because they fed on fear and could corrupt minds and turn defenders into enemies. Amy Brooks gave the order to fire, and the mountainside erupted with sound and light as humans opened up with everything they had, and bullets tore through the morning air in streams of deadly metal. The husks staggered under the assault, but kept coming because they felt no pain and had no fear, and could only be stopped by destroying enough of their physical form that shadow energy could no longer hold them together. Then the first explosives detonated, and whole sections of the approach route vanished in fire and smoke, and husks were thrown through the air or torn apart by shrapnel, and the advance slowed as they were channeled into the kill zones. Maggie had preparedly fought with her blade and magic, and beside her, Emberclaw launched into the sky, breathing fire across the enemy lines, and everywhere the dragon flames touched, husks burned and fell and did not rise again. The humans fought with disciplined efficiency, and they moved as units and covered each other and executed the tactics Beth had drilled into them, and Lyran saw veterans guiding civilians through the chaos and keeping them alive through experience and leadership. Claire weapons worked better than expected, and the energy burst disrupted shadow manifestations and caused husks to collapse when their animating force was scattered, and the devices bought precious seconds for conventional weapons to finish the job. But there were so many enemies, and they kept coming through the rift in waves, and the defensive line began to buckle under the pressure, and Lyran knew this was the critical moment where battles were won or lost. Then Maggie's plan activated fully, and suddenly the mountainside came alive with dangers that had nothing to do with human weapons, because the death world itself joined the fight. Containers broke open and released swarms of wasps that had been exposed to rift energy and given chemical signals, marking the Shadow Legion as prey, and the insects attacked with suicidal fury. The husks tried to ignore the swarms, but thousands of stings disrupted their coordination, and the wasps burrowed into corrupted flesh, seeking the energy cores that animated. The Badiz mountain lions appeared from hidden positions and attacked from unexpected angles, and their claws and teeth found weaknesses in husk armor, and they killed and vanished and killed again. Wolves hunted in coordinated packs, and they moved like shadows through the chaos and worked together to bring down larger husks, and their tactics were as sophisticated as any military unit. Of the plants became weapons, and areas where poison oak and ivy had been cultivated became barriers that husks struggled to cross because the oils interfered with shadow energy in ways nobody had predicted. But the real devastation came from Patricia. Biological agents and the specially designed bacteria began breaking down corrupted matter at the cellular level, and husks started falling apart from the inside. The Shadow Legion had conquered countless worlds and faced every weapon that advanced civilizations could develop, but they had never encountered an immune system that treated them as just another infection. Illyrian watched in amazement as the death world that had seemed like a curse revealed itself as the ultimate weapon, because everything here had evolved to kill, and humans had learned to direct that lethality at their enemies. The wraiths tried to turn the tide by attacking human minds and spreading fear and despair, but Claire network of emitters activated, and suddenly the incorporeal creatures were forced to manifest physically. Hunters who had spent lifetimes tracking game adjusted their aim and fired, and wraiths fell as conventional weapons found targets that should have been untouchable. Kate fought beside Lyran, and her modified rifle fired bursts of energy that scattered shadow manifestations. And between shots, she moved with the calm efficiency of someone who had been in combat before and knew how to survive. Beth coordinated the defense and shifted units to reinforce weak points and called in supporting fire and managed the chaos with a clarity that came from training and experience and natural talent for battlefield command. Linda maintained communication between all positions and tracked supplies and casualties and made decisions about when to hold ground and when to fall back, and she did it all from the command center while staying calm under pressure. Hours passed, and the battle raged and humans died. But they took terrible tolls on the enemy, and every husk that fell was one less attacker, and the Shadow Legion advanced, slowed, and stalled. A group of husks broke through the main line and charged toward a group of defenders who were reloading, and Liren moved to intercept, but Ellen Price got there first. The elderly woman threw a homemade explosive with practiced ease, and the device detonated perfectly and turned 3 husks into scattered fragments, and Helen rolled away from the blast and came up ready with another Devasalirine, helped her back to cover, and Helen smiled and said she'd been making things explode since before Liren was born, and this was just like the old days, except the enemies were uglier. Sophie King served as a runner carrying messages between positions in the 10-year-old moved through the battlefield with the fearlessness of someone too young to fully understand mortality, and she delivered every message and never hesitated. Burkle flew attack runs again and again in his flames, carved paths through the enemy forces, and human pilots and small aircraft coordinated with him and learned his patterns and supported his attacks with their own weapons. The dragon had fought beside elven warriors for centuries, but never had he experienced allies who adapted so quickly and worked so seamlessly with someone they had just met. By midday, the Shadow Legion assault began to falter, and the Vanguard had lost more than half its numbers, and the rift energy was destabilizing because the Legion had not expected this level of resistance. Ami ordered a counterattack, and human forces pushed forward and reclaimed ground and drove the surviving husks back toward the rift, and the momentum shifted completely. The last husks fell in a final desperate charge, and the wraiths fled back through the rift, and suddenly the battlefield was quiet, except for the sounds of humans checking on each other and securing the area. Liren stood among the carnage and looked at the destruction and calculated that 300 husks had been destroyed, and the human casualties were 18 dead and perhaps 30 wounded. Was a tragedy for those who lost friends and family, but by any military standard, it was an impossible victory, and Liren knew that no force her people had ever fielded could have achieved similar results. Gate found her and reported that Claire's sensors showed the rift was collapsing, and that there would be time to recover before the next assault. Liren said that the next attack would be larger, and the Shadow Legion would adapt, and Kate simply nodded and said they would adapt faster. Beth organized recovery teams to collect the fallen and treat the wounded and secure salvageable equipment, and everyone moved with purpose despite their exhaustion. Claire studied the husk remains and took samples and said she believed she could refine the corrupted matter into a power source that would make their weapons more effective. Maji walked the battlefield and made notes about what worked and what could be improved, and she was already planning enhancements for the next engagement. Linda coordinated with medical teams and supply chains, began the process of rebuilding defenses that had been damaged during the fight. That evening the town gathered in the square, and Linda spoke about those who had fallen and what they had died protecting, and she reminded everyone that the fight was not over, but she also celebrated the victory and acknowledged that they had achieved something remarkable and proven that humans could stand against threats that destroyed civilization's people. Shared food and drink and told stories about the battle, and processed their trauma together as communities do, and drew strength from each other. Liren sat with Kate and Emberclaw and watched the humans and felt something shift in her understanding of what strength meant. Kate asked if the Elven Council would believe what had happened here, and Liren said honestly that her people would assume she was lying or had gone mad. Emberclaw spoke and said that perhaps it was time the Elven realms learned that magic and technology were not the only paths to power. That night Liren could not sleep, and she walked through the town and saw humans standing watch and repairing defenses, and she saw the quiet determination on their faces. She found Sophie sitting on a porch, and the girl asked if the dragon was okay, and Liren said yes, and the Shadow Legion returned 6 days later, and this time they sent 2,000 husks and wraiths, and even some of the greater manifestations that Liren had only seen a few times in all her centuries of fighting. The humans were ready, and they had spent those 6 days improving their defenses and refining their tactics and building new weapons from the salvaged husk remains that Claire had learned to process. The battle began at dawn again, and this time, humans did not wait for the two enemy to reach their positions, but instead launched preemptive strikes, using the aircraft that had been armed with incendiary weapons. Semberclaw led the air assault, and the human pilots followed his lead, and they hit the rift approach with waves of fire before the Legion forces could fully organize. The effect was devastating, and hundreds of husks burned before they could advance, and the wraiths were disrupted by the heat and light, forced to manifest early where they were vulnerable. The Shadow Legion adapted, and the greater manifestations pushed forward, and these were beings of pure shadow energy that could not be destroyed by conventional means, and required concentrated magical attacks to disperse. Celerand had taught the humans about these entities, and Claire had developed special weapons specifically for them, but nobody knew if the theory would work in practice. Greater manifestations reached the defensive line and began tearing through barriers and corrupting the ground itself and spreading zones of darkness where human weapons became less effective. Then Beth triggered the trap, and the emitter network that had been designed for wraiths was reconfigured on the fly, and suddenly the greater manifestations found themselves caught in fields that disrupted their coherence. They started to break apart, and the humans poured concentrated fire into them and added Claire new weapons that fired bursts tuned to the exact frequencies that stabilized shadow energy. The greater manifestations fell one by one, and each time they dispersed, there was a flash of light and a sound like thunder, and the darkness they had spread receded. The Shadow Legion had never encountered defenders who could destroy greater manifestations, and their assault faltered as tactical calculations were revised. Maggie's second wave of environmental attacks activated, and this time she had added new elements based on what worked best in the first battle bears that had been baited. With scent trails attacked from the flanks, and their massive strength proved effective against even the larger husk. Swarms of insects were released in coordinated waves timed to disrupt enemy formations right before human forces attacked underground. Charges detonated and created pit traps and rock slides and channeled enemy forces into prepared kill zones. Patricia biological agents had been improved, and now they worked faster and spread more efficiently, and husks began falling apart within minutes of exposure. The battle lasted all day and into the night, and humans fought under artificial lights and used thermal imaging to track enemies in the darkness. Casualties mounted on both sides, and the humans lost more fighters this time, but they held their ground and refused to break even when pushed to the limit. Nicole had developed a communication system that let all units coordinate in real time, and commanders could shift forces and respond to threats with unprecedented speed. Linda managed the logistics from the command center and ensured that ammunition and medical supplies reached fighters when needed and that wounded were evacuated efficiently. Helen Price moved through the battlefield with her explosives, and she seemed to be everywhere at once, and husks learned to fear the elderly woman with devices in her hands. Kate fought with mechanical precision, and she saved Liren life twice, and Liren returned the favor 3 times, and they developed the wordless coordination that comes from trusting your partner. Compel Talimberkel was wounded when a greater manifestation caught him during a low pass in shadow. Energy burned across his wing, but he kept fighting, and the injury only made him more determined. Sophie served as a medic assistant, and the young girl who had lost her father showed courage beyond her years as she helped treat wounded fighters in the field. Hospital by midnight, the Shadow Legion withdrew, and the rift collapsed, and the humans had won again. But this time, the victory felt harder, and the cost was higher. 43 dead and 70 wounded, and everyone was exhausted and pushed beyond normal limits, and there was no celebration, only relief at having survived, but they had destroyed 2,000 husks and multiple greater manifestations, and proven that human defenses could scale up to meet larger threats. The next attack came 4 days later, and then 3 days after that, and then 2 days, and the pattern became clear that the Shadow Legion was probing and testing and trying to find weaknesses. Each battle was different, and the Legion adapted their tactics and sent different force compositions and tried to overwhelm specific defensive positions, but the humans adapted faster, and they learned from every engagement and shared knowledge across all units and continuously improved their capabilities, Claire. Weapons became more powerful and more efficient, and she developed new types specifically designed for different Shadow Legion entities. Patricia, biological warfare, became increasingly sophisticated, and she engineered agents that targeted specific aspects of shadow corruption. Maggie turned the entire region into a defensive weapon, and she knew every trail and every animal den and every natural hazard within 20 miles. Beth training program expanded to include everyone who could hold a weapon, and the town became a military force that could mobilize and deploy in minutes. After the 6th battle, Linda called a meeting with the core leadership group, and they reviewed their situation and acknowledged that the Shadow Legion was not going to stop. Kate said they needed to take the fight to the enemy and collapse the rifts permanently instead of just defending against each attack. Claire said she believed she could develop a device that would destabilize rift energy, but it would require someone to deliver it through an active rift during an assault. Lorraine said she would do it because she had experience with rift mechanics and could navigate the dimensional boundaries and find the anchor points, but Kate said no because Liren was too valuable as a combat leader and magical support, and they needed her here, coordinating defenses. Ami suggested they send a small team through during the next assault, while the Legion forces were focused on the main battle. Beth volunteered to lead the team, and Kate and Maggie and Nicole all volunteered to go with her. Linda approved the mission, and Claire began building the device, and everyone understood that this was incredibly dangerous and might not work though. Next attack came 2 days later, and it was the largest yet, and the Shadow Legion sent 5,000 husks and wraiths in greater manifestations. The battle was intense from the first moment, and humans fought with desperate determination because they knew their strike team needed time to reach the rift. Beth and her team moved through the chaos, and Claire had given them devices that masked their energy signatures and let them approach undetected. They reached the rift and went through, and suddenly they were in the space between dimensions where Shadow Legion forces staged their attacks. The environment was hostile and alien, and nothing worked the way it should, but the team pressed forward following the coordinates Claire had calculated. They found the anchor point, and Beth placed the device and activated it, and there was a moment of terrible energy, and the entire structure began collapsing. The team ran back toward the rift, and Nicole was caught by a wraith and went down, but Maggie pulled her free, and Kate provided covering fire. They made it through seconds before the rift collapsed completely, and the entire Shadow Legion assault force was cut off and trapped on the wrong side without reinforcements. The remaining husks were destroyed quickly, and the battlefield fell silent. And the humans had won their most significant victory, but the cost was high, because Beth had been wounded badly during the escape, and she died despite everything the medics tried to do. The town mourned her loss, and Linda spoke at the memorial about sacrifice and courage and what it meant to fight for something bigger than yourself. Kate took over training operations, and she carried forward Beth's legacy and made sure that every fighter understood the tactics and principles that had kept so many alive over the next week. No new rifts opened, and Claire's sensors showed that the dimensional barriers were stabilizing. Glirin monitored the Shadow Legion communications and detected confusion and strategic reassessment. Shadow Legion had never encountered a world that cost them so much for so little gain, and they were reconsidering whether Earth was worth continued assault on. In the 10th day after the last battle, a communication attempt reached through the dimensional barriers, and Claire managed to capture and translate it. The message was simple and shocking, because the Shadow Legion wanted to negotiate, and that had never happened before in all of recorded history. The Shadow Legion communication came through Claire equipment as pure energy that had to be translated into concepts and then into words, and the process was imperfect, but the meaning was clear enough. They wanted to understand what they were facing, and why this world was different from every other world they had encountered, and they were willing to pause their assault to learn. Laren stood in the laboratory with Kate and Linda and Claire, and they debated whether to respond and what to say, and whether this was a trap. Kate argued they should respond because communication was better than fighting, and if they could convince the Legion to leave permanently, then they would save countless lives. Linda worried it was a trick to buy time. While the Legion prepared a bigger assault, Claire said, the energy patterns suggested genuine confusion and reassessment rather than deception. Illyrian explained that the Shadow Legion did not normally do deception because they had never needed to, and they operated on logic and cost-benefit analysis. They decided to respond, and Kate insisted on doing the talking because she said this was about representing humanity, and she understood her own species better than anyone. Claire set up the communication. Link and Kate spoke, and Lyran translated and amplified the message through magic. Kate told them that Earth was Class 15, not because humans were victims, but because everything on this world had evolved to be lethal, and humans had survived by becoming more lethal than everything else. She explained that humans had no magic and limited technology, and had faced extinction multiple times, but had always found ways to survive. Through determination and innovation, she said that Shadow Legion tactical assumptions were wrong because they treated primitive species as easy targets, but humans had proven that primitive did not mean weak. The Shadow Legion responded with questions about how humans had survived their own world, and Kate explained about tools and cooperation and the ability to learn and adapt faster than threats could evolve. She told them about human history and the wars and struggles and how competition had driven innovation and made humans incredibly efficient at violence when necessary. She explained that every animal on Earth was either predator or prey, and humans had learned from both and become something that could switch between roles as needed. Though a Shadow Legion asked about human social structures, and Kate described how humans formed groups and nations and alliances, and how they could fight each other fiercely but also unite against common threats. She told them that humans had explored their entire world and survived in every environment, from frozen poles to burning deserts, and learned to extract resources from places that should be uninhabitable. The Shadow Legion processed this information and then asked why humans fought so hard for a world that was constantly trying to kill them. Kate was quiet for a moment, and then she said because it was their world, and home was worth fighting for, and humans had nowhere else to go. She said that maybe species that lived on peaceful worlds with abundant resources never learned the value of what they had, but humans knew exactly what it cost to survive. Hertha Shadow Legion responded with an assessment, and it came through as a series of calculations and projections about resource costs versus potential gains. They stated that Earth's human defensive cabinet exceeded their initial projections by orders of magnitude, and that continued assault would require resources that could be better spent on softer targets. They stated that human adaptation rate was unprecedented, and suggested that even if they committed greater forces, the outcome was uncertain. They stated that Earth exhibited characteristics of a hostile environment, unsuitable for Shadow Legion manifestation, and that the native life form showed aggressive resistance at all scales. Then came the message that changed everything, and the Shadow Legion formally classified Earth as a threat rather than a target. They announced withdrawal from this dimensional sector and stated that human territory would be avoided in future expansion plans. The communication ended, and the laboratory was silent as everyone processed what had just happened. Had won not by destroying the Shadow Legion, but by convincing them that Earth was too dangerous and too expensive to be worth conquering. Kate sat down heavily and said that this was the most surreal negotiation she had ever been part of, and she had once talked down an armed standoff between rival gangs. Linda asked if they could trust the Shadow Legion to actually withdraw, and Lyran said that the Legion did not lie about tactical decisions because deception required theory of mind they did not possess. Claire said her sensors showed rift activity across the region was decreasing and dimensional barriers were stabilizing, and all evidence suggested the withdrawal was real. Over the next week, new attacks came, and the rifts continued closing, and human scouts reported no Shadow Legion presence anywhere in the territory. The spell began to relax, and people started rebuilding and returning to normal life, and the constant state of alert gradually faded, but they kept the defenses in place and maintained training schedules because Kate said that prepared communities stayed safe. Communities. Laren stood with Emberclaw, the hillside where she had first doubted human capability and looked down at Elbrook and thought about how much had changed. The dragon spoke and said that the Shadow Legion had learned an expensive lesson about underestimating species from Deathworld's gate, joined them and brought coffee, and they sat together and watched the sunset and enjoyed the peace of Lyrian. Said she wanted to send a message back to the Elven Council and tell them what had happened, and Kate asked what she would say. Lyrian composed the message in her mind and then spoke it aloud, and Kate listened and nodded approval. The message explained that exile to Earth had not been punishment but education, and that humans were not primitive but rather had evolved different strengths. Stated that the Shadow Legion had withdrawn because humans made a Class 15 Death World into their fortress and defended it with the same ferocity. The world had taught them. It suggested that the Elven realms might want to reconsider their assumptions about species that lacked magic and relied on what the elves called primitive methods. It concluded by saying that Lyrian was staying on Earth permanently because she had found allies who valued courage over tradition and action over endless debate. She sent the message through magical channels that would reach the council, and then she'd let it go, because whether they believed her or not no longer mattered. Kate asked what she thought the council would do with the information, and Lyrian said they would probably dismiss it and continue their old ways until reality forced them to change, but someday the Elven realms would need allies against threats they could not handle alone, and when that day came, they would remember that Earth existed. Maggie came up the hill and said that Helen was organizing a celebration dinner, and everyone was invited, and there would be too much food and probably some drinking. They went down together and joined the gathering in the town square, and people shared stories and laughed and enjoyed being alive. Sophie found Lyrian and asked if she could learn magic now that the fighting was over, and Lyrian said yes and thought that teaching humans magic might be dangerous but also interesting. Nicole and Patricia discussed their research projects and talked about combining human science with elven magic in systematic ways in creating entirely new fields of study. And the militia reviewed lessons learned and documented tactics and strategies for future reference because humans always thought about the next threat. Linda announced that Millbrook was establishing formal relations with Lyrian as representative of the Elven realms, and that Earth would welcome peaceful contact with other civilizations. Showed off her latest inventions and explained how human technology had jumped forward dramatically by incorporating magical principles. Kate pulled Lyrian aside later and thanked her for bringing the warning about the Shadow Legion, and said that without it, many more people would have died. Lyrian said that she should thank Kate for taking the threat seriously when anyone else would have dismissed her as insane. They agreed they were even, and Kate said that next time aliens showed up on Earth, they would be ready, because humans learned from experience. Simbrel curled up near the fire, and children climbed on him and asked questions, and the dragon patiently answered and let them touch his scales. Helen brought food and insisted everyone eat more, and she told stories about previous wars and how this one compared, and everyone listened with respect. As the night wore on, people drifted away to their homes and families, and the square gradually emptied until only a few remained. Lyrian stood with Kate under the stars and thought about the strange path that had led from exile to this moment. Kate said that the Elven Council had meant to punish her, but instead they had given her freedom and purpose, and real friends. Lyrian agreed, and said that sometimes the worst moments in life turned into the best things if you were brave enough to see the opportunity. She thought about her people safe behind their barriers and following their ancient traditions, and she felt no desire to return to that life. Earth was dangerous and chaotic and unpredictable, and everything the Elven realms were not. And that was exactly why she wanted to stay. The humans had taught her that strength came not from avoiding challenges, but from facing them and adapting and becoming stronger.